Okay, class. So we are going to go ahead and review rounding decimals. And this is for anybody that was unable to attend our live session. So just to go ahead and go over it, when we are rounding decimals, right, we're going to go ahead and practice using this, doing it on a number line, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of examples so that we understand how to use the number line, and then we are able to complete the assignment on our own. So let's go ahead and practice using some different examples. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with my first example. Okay, so for my first example, I'm going to go ahead and use the number 2 and 67 hundredths. Okay, so if I have 2 and, sorry, and I should have done that, 2 and 67 hundredths. Okay, and if I'm asking you to round to the nearest tenths place, okay, so what I have to do is I have to remember that when I am doing this, I am looking at, as always, my place value chart, right? And so if I am looking at my place value chart, I have to remember that when I set this number up in a place value chart, I'm going to have my ones. I'm going to have my decimal, which is what I call the word, and I'm just going to use the symbol right now, the symbol end. And then I have my tenths and my hundredths, okay? So when I am rounding to the nearest tenths place, okay, I'm going to practice doing that one first. If I have this number, I'm going to go ahead and set it up as 2 and 67 hundredths, and I want to go ahead and round it to the nearest tenths place. Well, now that I've used my place value chart, I know clearly that my 6 is in my tenths place. When I am rounding on a number line, I have to think, okay, the number 67, okay, when I'm looking at that number 67. 67, when I'm thinking about it on even, say, a hundredths chart, I know that that would be if I have 2 and I would have it, it lands anywhere between 2 and 60 and 2 and 70, okay? Now, I always have to find what I call the halfway point. So what number is halfway between 60 and 70? And so this is where, just like in our rounding coaster, for our rounding coaster, if you remember, right, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, the deciding factor is always 5. So I like to say that that would be our halfway point. So between 2 and 60 and 2 and 70 hundredths, the halfway point would be 2 and 65. Okay, so then I have to go ahead and look at my number 2 and 67 hundredths. Okay, and the reason I say 5, guys, is the halfway point, aside from it being in the middle between 60 and 70, 5 is how I decide if I am rounding up or if I am letting my number rest. So 2 and 67, I can see, right, if I am looking at this, I can see that 2 and 67, I have to think, okay, does 2 and 67 land between 2 and 60 and 2 and 65? Or does 2 and 67 land in between 2 and 65 and 2 and 70? Well, I know that 2 and 67 would actually come, if I have 65, I know that then it's 66, 67, 68, 69. So 2 and 67 would actually land between 2 and 65 and 2 and 70. So because it lands between 2 and 65 and 2 and 70, that means that I would go ahead and round 2 and 67, when rounded to the nearest tenths place, is going to round up to 2 and 70 hundredths. Or 2 and 7 tenths, because remember, 2 and 70 hundredths and 2 and 7 tenths is exactly the same. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and practice doing another problem. Okay, we're going to go ahead and practice now doing another problem. So I'm going to go ahead and, for our second problem, we're going to go ahead now and try to round 4 and 72 hundredths. So I have 4 and 72 hundredths. And again, I am trying to round to the nearest tenths place. So my first step is going to be to set up my place value chart. I have my ones, my decimal, which like I said, I call my end symbol. I have my tenths, and I have my hundredths. So now I'm going to take my number and I'm going to set it up in my place value chart. 4 and 72 hundredths. And I want to round to the nearest, I want us to round to the nearest tenths place. So if I'm rounding to the nearest tenths place, I can clearly see that the number that's in my tenths place is going to be my 7. Okay? So now that I see that, I have to think, okay, looking at 72, does 72, what two numbers does 72 land between, right? And remember, I'm thinking within a range of 10. So I know 4 and 72. If I'm looking at 72, I know 72 lands between 70 and 80. So now my job is to set it up on my number line. So I would go ahead and set up, I have 4 and 70. And on the other end, I have 4 and 80. Okay? So now I'm going to be looking right at 4 and 72. And again, I'm thinking of my halfway point. And if you remember when I talked about our rounding coaster, we said that the halfway point, because the point that determines if I'm going to round up or let it rest, is the number 5. So my halfway point is always going to be that 5, okay? So between 4 and 70 and 4 and 80, I have 4 and 75. So now my job is to look at this and to figure out, okay, does 4 and 72 land between 4 and 70 and 4 and 75? Or does 4 and 72 land between 4 and 75 and 4 and 80 hundredths? Okay, so looking at 4 and 72, I can clearly see that it lands, I have 470, 71, 72, 73, 74. So I see 4 and 72 would land right here. And because 4 and 72 lands right here in this spot, then that tells me that 4 and 72 is closer to 4 and 70 than it is to 4 and 80. So this would round to 4 and 70 hundredths, or remember, you can also write it as 4 and 7 tenths, because we learned that when we even it out, having a 0 there is like having a blank there. It means the same thing, right? Having a blank, because 0 is worth nothing, right? It has a value of 0. So it is the same thing if I write 4 and 70 hundredths, or if I were to write 4 and 7 tenths, okay? We're going to go ahead and practice doing one more as a rounding to the tenths, and then we're going to go into rounding to the thousandths. Okay, we're going to go ahead and practice now rounding to the thousandths place. Okay, and we're going to see how that looks different than rounding to, I'm sorry, not the thousandths place, rounding to the hundredths place. And we're going to see how that looks different than rounding to the tenths place. So if I go ahead and set up my next problem is going to be 5 and 183 thousandths, okay? Now, I said that I want to round this number to the nearest hundredths place, right? And so I know, right? I'm telling you I know that that's my hundredths, but remember your job is to set up your place value chart. So I have my ones, then I have my end symbol, then I have my tenths, my hundredths, and my thousandths, okay? So when I write my number out, I'm going to go ahead and take 5 and 183 thousandths. And remember, the reason we're using our number line is to make sure that we do know what place is in the or what number is in the hundredths place, which of course is going to be my number 8. Okay, so now when I am looking at that number, Okay, if I am still rounding to that number right there, the hundredths place, okay, if I'm rounding to that one, I'm going to take a look at 183. Remember, we are still following that rule of we're going between 10, okay? So I'm not going to say that this lands between 100 and 200 because I'm not rounding to the nearest tenths place. I'm rounding to the nearest hundredths. So I'm looking at that place and I'm saying, okay, 183. If I'm going within 10, that's my rule. I have to think 183 would land, okay, and I'm going to skip that number line here and I'm going to do it right here, just for space. I have 5 and 180, or 5 and 190. We can see how that's following that, right, that 10. So I'm not going higher than 10 here whenever I am rounding. So please remember that. Okay, it has to be reasonable. It has to make sense. I'm not going to say that 180 can be between 183 can be between 180 and say like 200, right? I've gone way above. Okay, I cannot do that. So that's how come I have to stay within 10. So again, the halfway, remember that we talked about the rounding coaster and we talked about how we're looking at that 5 because that's the determining factor. So I would go ahead and mark my halfway point here, and that's 5 and 185. Okay? So now my job is to look at my actual number that I am rounding, and I'm saying, okay, 183. Well, 5 and 183, does that land between 5 and 180 and 5 and 185? Or does that land between 5 and 185 thousandths and 5 and 190 thousandths? Well, I know that 183 definitely comes before 185, so I know that it would go ahead and be placed here, 5 and 183 thousandths, which tells me if it lands anywhere here, it's going to be closer to 5 and 180. Okay, so this number here, when rounded to the nearest hundredths, would round to 5 and 180 thousandths. Or remember, you can also say 5 and 18 hundredths, because having nothing here is the same as having a 0. Okay? And so again, if you have any questions on how to complete your assignment, please go ahead and send me a message, but please make sure you look over this lesson before completing the assignment online.